Warren and Charlie had their annual get together last week. You probably know Warren's name better without Charlie's name, but Warren and Charlie would be a good name to a book if anyone wants to write the 67th book on Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger. But Warren and Charlie had their jamboree this weekend, and a couple things really caught my attention. One of them being from Charlie himself, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But before I do, it's so interesting how branding and how susceptible our human brains are to branding, and how branding feels good, like saying, yeah, I got my money at Goldman Sachs. Like, that's branding, right? I mean, that's a brand. So the assumption is, wow, I must be really doing well with my money. Or I've got my money at Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan, though I don't know how strong those brands are these days. But that idea of branding is very powerful to the human brain, right? I'm not a Chevy guy. I'm a Ford guy. I'm not a BMW guy. I'm an Audi guy. No, I'm a Tesla girl. No, I'm not a Tesla girl. I'm a Mercedes girl. Though my sister would get mad if I said girl. I should say woman or gal, but not girl. Sorry about that, ladies. But this branding thing is so important. And so with that, it really leads into something I noticed this week in an article that I really want to share with you, because it sheds light on just how difficult it is for humans to escape or separate from their lesser self. Hey everybody, this is RC Peck, and this is my weekend podcast. It's episode number 330, and the theme to this weekend's episode podcast is, I put Warren's picture on here, not Warren and Charlie, but it's really a conversation or a sermon that Warren had, but even more important, it was a comment that Charlie Munger had. And so I need to just lay out the story a little bit before I show you these three very powerful price charts. So before lunch on Saturday's annual meeting, Warren kind of started to, or got into what I guess could only be called a sermon about how people are much better off using low-income passive index funds, which I'm a huge believer of. I say, and if you have not heard it from me before, I say, look, your foundation, your starting point is to buy the S&P 500 and reinvest dividends and just buy your $1,000 of it a month. That's your foundation. And if you just start with that foundation, you will be in front of 99% of all investors. Maybe it's even more than 99% now, and I'll get back to that. But what Warren was starting off with was he made a bet with a hedge fund company called Protégé Partners, saying, look, in the next 10 years, you will underperform the S&P 500. And so the Protégé Partner founder said, we'll take that bet. It was $1 million bet. They each had their own charity, and they started in 2008. And so far today, Protégé Partners is up about 21% from 2008. There's a couple years left. And the S&P 500 during the same time period, man, I'm going from memory right now, is up about 70%. The exact percentage is not the point, but that the S&P is absolutely crushing Protégé Partners. And Warren goes on to talk about how he can't get people to listen to him. He can't get anyone to listen to him. He talks about how the endowments and the pensions and the family offices and very wealthy people, they have this belief that they have to hire consultants with complicated strategies who use the words algorithms, who have people from MIT or Columbia or Stanford or Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Cornell, or University of Chicago. I'm sure I'm leaving some out. And then, they're of course good looking in nice suits. And so they go, yeah, these people are going to implement this really complicated system. And Warren goes on and goes, I can't convince people. I can't convince endowments and pension funds and family offices. I can't convince them, even with data, that what's best for them is to fire all those people. And sometimes I think about my role, or my job. Sometimes I had a conversation this week with someone who is very well-to-do, and he believes in the complicated approach. And who am I to say he shouldn't have something different? Owns lots of assets and has done well in business, And, he's like, look, I'm fine. And you know what? He is fine. He doesn't need to change anything. He's in his 60s and he will never run out of money. So, he is fine. And maybe that's the thing with a lot of people. They're like, yeah, I'm fine. But I want to go after the people who want their money to grow as effectively as possible as it can, but they just don't know what's really going on because kind of the lies that have come out of big box and conventional and Wall Street and the whole industrial investment complex. But the thing that really struck me is if Warren Buffett can't convince people, he's like the richest guy on the planet, right? Okay, of course he's not. He's like number 2 or number 3 some years. But this guy can't even convince people that there's a better way. And I just found it interesting because sometimes, I'll talk to someone, they'll be like, well, who are you, RC? Like, and they'll kind of say like, your house isn't big enough or you're not like rich enough. Like if you were so right about this, how come you're not king of the world? And it just, from a lighthearted point of view, I think, well, here is the king of the world telling people, and he can't, I don't want to even use the word convince. He can't even enroll the idea that there's a better way that is not complicated. So here's the best part about the annual meeting, and it was lost on, I think, everybody except you guys, and this is going to be great. I'm going to show it to you in three price charts. So Warren's talking about all the commercial push behind telling people that they ought to, have this complicated approach with intelligent people. And then as a counterpoint, Berkshire's vice chairman, Charlie Munger, kind of jumps in and kind of stops Warren and goes, but Warren, you're talking to a bunch of people who have solved their problems by buying Berkshire Hathaway. That's worked even better. Meaning it's worked even better than just buying the S&P 500. And this is what I want to share with you. So on this first price chart here, here's Berkshire Hathaway B shares. And by the way, the only reason why Warren and Charlie, War and Char came up with B shares is because they had to, is because hedge funds and mutual funds were about to buy a bunch of A shares and not split A shares, but split mutual fund shares and hedge fund shares so people could have more access to their A shares. And they didn't want that to happen, so they made B shares. They were forced to making B shares, not for the betterment of all the people in the stadium at their annual meeting, but because they had to. So look, here is a price chart of, Berkshire Hathaway. Not bad. Looks pretty good. Started around $50 in 2009. It's about $140 today. Not bad, right? Not bad. Buy the shares. It's $8.95 on Schwab to get these, and you're done. But this is the comment and this is the point I want to make to you. Charlie's comment. And here's the point. Look at this price chart right here. This is a price chart that's 8.5 years old. The blue line on this price chart is the S&P 500 with dividends invested back in, including dividends. It's the blue line. And the S&P's up 72% over the last 8.5 years. This is the most recent 8.5 years. And look, I could have done it from 2009, but it would have even made Berkshire look even worse. And then Berkshire B shares, which B shares and A shares do about the same, is up 63%. So I think it's really funny that even Charlie and Warren can't beat the passive. And look, buying the S&P 500 with 500 stocks, 400 of which pay dividends, is a much safer bet because your risk is spread out across 500 shares and not Berkshire's. They probably have about 40 in total. The majority of their money is in about 3 stocks. But look, they can't even. Hey, Charlie, you guys didn't even outrun the S&P over the last 8.5 years. And then I just zoomed back a little bit more. I'm like, well, what if I zoomed back maybe 15 years? It's just, let me get a better picture. Over the last decade and a half, S&P 500's up 201% and Berkshire's up 200%. And I apologize, this should say 210%. My dyslexic brain put the 0 where the 1 should be. But the S&P's up 210% a year. And by the way, I'm not ripping on dyslexics. I actually have a dyslexic brain. And Berkshire, it underperformed by 10% with much more business risk because their money was only in 40 shares, 40 different companies. And really, it was only in about 3 different companies. But hey, Charlie, pay attention to your own data. Of course, Charlie is richer than me and will probably be richer than I ever will be. But here's the point I really, really want to make and take home. It is really, really darn hard to sell simple because our brains have such deep desires to believe that complicated is better. And that is the takeaway. That is actually one of the takeaways, that simple, and maybe it shouldn't be simple is really hard to sell. It should be simple or straightforward is hard to believe, is hard to digest, is hard to just even comprehend that. How is this possible, RC? I mean, the industrial investment complex is a $1 trillion entity, trillions of dollars in size. There's no way one little ticker symbol could crush them all. The brain can't even manage that. But that is the takeaway, that straightforward works. And that's one of the things that I teach on my diversification myth training, which if you haven't watched the diversification myth training, I actually put a link to it in my PS. But that, not only is straightforward powerful, but it's actually hard for the brain to believe that it'll actually work. 3 more takeaways because I did not touch on them and I wanted to. Look, S&P is still in a sideways trend, guys. 24 months, it's in a 15% channel. It's not going anywhere. It is bouncing between that 15%. It's very, very anxiety producing for a lot of people. But until it makes a break up, out, or out and down, there's not much to do right now. Gold is continuing to move higher. People cannot believe that it is continuing to move higher, but it is, in fact, is moving higher. Had a great training called Peak Gold a week or 2 weeks ago, talking about gold and how important it is to people. And it's not actually the gold itself, but it's how you actually own it. That was the whole point of Peak Gold, that it's not necessarily about gold itself, but it's how you own it. That's what matters most, is the strategy. And bond prices themselves are going higher. That means yields are going lower. Those are the takeaways. I am with the kids for the second weekend in a row. This weekend, last week, Burgess was in New York City for a couple days with her sister, seeing some Broadway plays, which was great for her. And this weekend, she's doing a retreat with one of her best friends. So I got another 48 hours with the 5 and 8-year-old. I love them. They will test and trigger every part of my system. And every so often in those 48 hours, I step back and just get the wonderment of having these kids in my life. And I also have a wonderment of having you in my life. I do appreciate you, though I may not speak to you directly. Thank you for being in my world. You make a difference. You guys have a great weekend. And this is just another step in helping you protect and grow your portfolio and your future. Until next time, this is RC Peck.